We've all lived through the trials and tribulations of being a teenager. Not quite knowing where you fit in with the cliques at school, having an awkward growth spurt at exactly the wrong time, and having to deal with the stress and pressure of exams. Life as a teenager is hard, but how hard could it have been for a Viking teen? No formal school, no social media to capture your hesitant attempts at the latest TikTok trends, and no detentions. On the other hand, Vikings were formally considered to be adults when they reached their 16th winter. At that point, girls had to assume full control over running their household, and boys had to be providing food and protection to their families. So maybe surviving the Viking age as a teenager would have been just a little more challenging than we think. Welcome to the Viking Vault. Training for adulthood. Since life expectancy for the average Viking was only about 45 to 50 years, getting ready to take on your daily responsibilities would have been a major part of any Viking teenager's life. Some would have gone on to become an apprentice artisan, whilst others would have stayed in the family home and learned skills such as hunting and fishing, as well as farming. As mentioned in one of our other videos about surviving the Viking age as a child, childhood and adolescence can be argued to be modern inventions. Obviously, there were children and teenagers in the Viking age, but there wasn't the same attitude that we have today, where we treat children as innocent with a need to be educated rather than working. In fact, Old Norse doesn't even have a word for adolescence, so perhaps Viking communities would have been split into children and adults once the young people had crossed a certain threshold. Teens would stay in their family home until they got married, continuing the training that they started as children to be able to step into their roles as adults as soon as they left home. According to the Icelandic Gragas, you were considered legally able to manage your own affairs at 16. But these laws also state that boys of 12 could be punished for crimes committed, so perhaps adulthood came early for Icelandic adolescents. Viking Apprentices. As we said, Vikings were in favour of practical training. Education was pragmatic and focused on the skills a teenager would need to manage their own home or build a career for themselves. And one of the most common ways to earn a living in the Viking age was to become a craftsman. That could include anything from pottery to glassworking, boneworking, or shipbuilding. Viking families used common workshops to develop whatever trade they needed to, and it seems that they brought their children to work with them every day. Without much in the way of extant evidence for apprentices in the Viking age, it takes a bit of guesswork to frame what a teenager's life as an apprentice potter would have been. It's likely that this sort of career training would have dated from the later Viking period after the population started clustering in towns. While workshops were common in rural Viking settlements, there's a lot more evidence for commercial craftsmanship in places like York and Dublin. Pre-adolescents would be drawn into working for a master from a young age, and by the time they reached their teens they would likely be able to generate their own income. Even so, this would have meant long days in the workshop in occasionally dangerous situations. Metalworkers risked burns and heat exhaustion, whilst glassworkers also risked burns and inhaling dangerous fumes. Young brides. Unfortunately, most women didn't have that many opportunities outside the home, although that definitely isn't the women stay at home in the kitchen and provide their man a martini at 6 PM kind of thinking. Mothers would teach their daughters all the skills they'd need to run their household effectively, which gave them a lot of control over how things happened at home. While the men went out to hunt, the wives stayed home to spin and weave cloth, cook, tend livestock, and much more. They churned butter and yogurt and would help with the harvest and haymaking in the autumn. All of this to say that teenage girls in the Viking age didn't really go to school, but would have learned valuable skills by watching their mothers and aunts. They also married young. The Sagas of the Icelanders has a number of stories where the marriage was between an older man and a girl of 12 or 13. In the very pragmatic mindset of the time, a young bride was more appealing since women often died in childbirth, and so marrying early was seen as normal practice. Young warriors. It's inevitable that Viking teens would have seen and experienced violence, as well as participating in it themselves. From a young age, boys would have learned to fight and hunt, and ultimately take part in raids and wars. Archaeologically, it's been hard to trace teens in armed conflict in the Viking age until recently. The skeletons of young people have been found at Repton, Derbyshire, where the Viking Great Army wintered in 873. A mass grave lies just outside the grounds of the local church and contains the remains of over 250 individuals, while a nearby grave holds the skeletons of 3 children and 1 teenager. Some historians have argued that the remains found in that grave were sacrifices linked to the mass grave, but we can't say for certain that they actually were involved in the violence. However, more recent discoveries seem to link the teens to the actual act of war itself. A mass burial from Ridgeway Hill in Weymouth shows strong indications that the 50 decapitated individuals were Viking raiders from the 10th or early 11th century. Of the skeletons examined, at least 6 were clearly adolescents between 13 to 17 years of age. While there aren't any injuries on the remains that show that those teens were involved in the fighting, their bodies do number among the decapitated dead, so they must have been close enough that killing children seemed acceptable. Teens in text. With all these standard caveats we have around the reliability and limitations we run up against the Old Norse texts, it appears that Viking violence didn't exclude teenagers, at least according to some of the sagas. In Leik's saga, Gudrun Osvifurstatir encourages her sons to avenge their father's death in chapter 53, calling them cowards for not killing the man who murdered their father, despite only being children at the time. In Jomsvikings saga, a tale about the tensions between the royal families of Denmark and Norway, and a brotherhood known as the Jomsvikings, a boy of 15 joins the group and starts his life as a raider. An even younger boy decides to join up and fight alongside Jomsvikings after he and his warriors emerge victorious in a battle against them. There are multiple other references to Viking teenagers joining raids or avenging their murdered relatives, including a mention in Egil's saga of a 15-year-old boy being in charge of a body of men, as well as an 18-year-old getting scolded for not getting involved in the fighting at a much earlier age. Having fun. All work and no play makes Bjorn a dull Viking, as we all know. But in a world before social media and the internet, and in a culture where books and literacy were a rare phenomenon, what would a Viking teen be able to do to relax after a long day on the farm? Well, in the summer, it's easy to imagine a group of teenagers gathered outside enjoying the long evenings with their friends and family. But in the winter, when the sun went down early and the teens were trapped in their longhouses, Vikings found ways to entertain themselves. When the weather was good enough, Viking teens would strap on a pair of skates and take themselves down to the iced-over fjords where they raced each other. If they didn't fancy their luck on the ice, they could crack out their skis and race down the valley sides. To be transparent, it's likely that skiing was less of a sport for thrill-seekers and more of a useful way to hunt in deep snow. But it's possible that Viking teens would hone their skills on the skis in competitions with their friends. Although Vikings didn't invent either skiing or skating, they did popularize them both and actually gave us the modern word ski, which comes from the Old Norse phrase skjora askiom, which literally means to stride on skis. Even Viking gods weren't immune to the thrill of racing through the snow on skis. Both Ur and Skjoi were frequently shown on skis, including a medieval etching of Ulr travelling the seas on a magic bone with a wooden pole resting on his shoulder. We have archaeological evidence for both of these pastimes too, with ice skates being found throughout the Viking Empire from Berka to Yorkrum, and even the old Viking stronghold in Dublin. Skis don't appear to have been so well preserved, and are more commonly found in glaciers in mountain passes. Some of the skates were made from iron, but it seems that the majority would have been made from bone. In Berka, Sweden, a selection of bone skates with leather thongs to attach them to their feet were found that match up to the writings of Alois Magnus, a medieval chronicler. Magnus describes the Vikings as nimble on their feet, going on to say how they would attach the flat bones of deer or oxen to their feet. He explains that these bones are naturally slippery thanks to their inherent greasiness and can help Vikings travel at great speed, although only on smooth ice. Famous Viking teens. Harald Hardrada is well known as one of the Haralds involved in the whole 1066 endeavour, invading England with a large army and trying to take control of this new land by force. But did you know that his violent nature dated all the way back to his teens? At the tender age of 15, Harald Hardrada fought at the Battle of Stiklestad in Norway and distinguished himself as a fierce warrior. However, fate did not smile on young Harald, and he was forced to flee after his side lost the war. Our teenage Viking warrior absconded with nothing but his wits and made his way to Constantinople by way of Kiev, both places that would welcome a young lad who'd already proved himself in battle. Harald joined the Varangian Guard when he came to Constantinople, fighting as part of an elite unit made up of Vikings from Scandinavia, Englishmen, and Normans. He worked his way up through the ranks, shortly becoming a commander of men and fighting all across the Byzantine Empire. Another Viking heavyweight champion who started making a name for himself from an early age was Canute. Son of King Svein Forkbeard, Knut was born in 996 AD and joined his father in his raids to England. After Svein died in 1014, Knut, aged only 18, stayed in England and led the Danish army for 2 years before assuming the throne as the only king of England. Outro. Viking teens were definitely a hardy bunch, with most getting married and starting their own households by the age of 16 or so. They worked hard within the family unit and contributed in whatever way they could, from hunting and gathering food to bringing an income from an apprenticeship. But that doesn't mean they didn't have time for fun. Skating, board games and storytelling would have made up a large part of their lives too. Viking teens were more likely to survive into adulthood as well, so long as they didn't get recruited to join the raiding parties. Being a teenager wasn't easy, as they tried to navigate their family loyalties whilst also carving a space for their own lives in the Viking world they lived in. Thank you for watching this episode of the Viking Vault. I do hope you've enjoyed it, and please subscribe if you want to help support the channel. See you next week for another video. Cheers!